Welcome to Exceptional Conscious Experiences, the last lecture of the Rational Spirituality Crash Course, where I think that you can learn something about consciousness, your essence of what you are, which is what spirit means, without having to take on board anything on faith or believe anything without evidence. You know, I'm not here to push any dogma on you. We're here to figure something out. We're at the end of the course, but let's look at where we've been. We've looked at unifying science and consciousness, where we try and get an overview, a simple overview of the story of science. And then we get a simple overview of the story of consciousness. We've got enough information from that to try and at least get some insight into the mystery as to how we integrate these two different stories together. There's several different ways that we can try and do this, and that's what we cover in the first lecture. So we move on to the second lecture, the demonstrable power of free will. People win and lose the argument of free will by wangling around different definitions. It's very important that you keep that in mind and you decide for yourself what constitutes the correct definition and where the wiggle room is. If you just allow anybody to tell you what a word means and persuade you one way or the other on something, you're just going to end up a confused mess. You know, like Sam Harris. Fighting talk. So let's try and understand that perspective. Let's try and understand the case against free will. Why does Sam think the things that he does, right? We cover that. We try and really steelman the intellectual case against free will before moving on to the case for free will and finishing off with the pièce de résistance of a demonstration, a logical proof that you have free will. We're going to spoil the answer to that this lecture, so if you actually fancy taking it in properly before the spoilers, you should do that before watching this. The third lecture, we look at, are we trapped in the Matrix? Okay, so there's a touch of the metaphysical here, but largely it's how do we end up with the belief systems that we do? How do we get trained by other people to believe things? And how much are we free-thinking people who evaluate all the evidence and make rational decisions? You might be surprised. Now we're looking at exceptional conscious experiences. Let's give you a little overview of what we'll be covering. What's an exceptional conscious experience? What counts as one? Should we take them seriously? If somebody tells you that something a bit weird and spooky happened to them, can we just ignore them? Can we just pretend that it's just a flight fancy of their imagination that we don't really have to care? Can we do that? Should we do that? Let's look at impossible things as well. Since we're on the subject of things that don't seem to be achievable, don't seem to be possible, let's look at other impossible things, and we'll use that to give us a notion of how human beings slap the label of impossible onto various things. And after being somewhat controversial this lecture, we'll be looking at the anticipated objections. So, let's get going. What's an exceptional conscious experience? Well, what's a normal conscious experience? That's probably going to be pretty important in the analysis, right? Having a shower, you know, there's a certain quality to that. Eating breakfast, right? You've just got up, you're going through the normal routine. Eating breakfast. Driving to work, that's a normal conscious experience. When does it become exceptional? You almost crashed your car, and for a heart-stopping moment, time around you seems to slow down. Wow, that's pretty exceptional. But this sensation that it feels like time slows down around you, that's not unusual to people in general. This is something that quite a few people feel like they experience, and maybe you're one of those people. It's an exceptional moment in our conscious lives. Let's crank it up a notch. Sorry about this. We're going through, we're going through a course of imagining stuff in order to understand stuff. So bear with me as we do this. You actually crash your car and you nearly die. And you have a near-death experience. You leave your body, and that's a shock in itself, because you thought you were your body, right? You thought you were your brain. You thought that was isomorphic. You thought it was the same thing. You're like, holy crap, I'm like a spiritual creature having a physical experience. I know quite a lot of you won't believe that. That's not the point. We're understanding an NDE here, okay? So just run with it for the time being, suspend your disbelief. You can analyse it later. It's not a big deal. It's not a problem. So maybe you see loved ones who've passed on. You get a sense of being connected with the rest of the universe. And then you go back. You go back to living your life. But you're transformed by this NDE. Now, that is an exceptional conscious experience. And they happen. They happen quite a lot. Right, okay, well, should we take them seriously? Clearly not. Obviously, we are our brains, and that's just a load of nonsense, and we shouldn't take these exceptional conscious experiences seriously. But why would you? We understand the world. Right. Oh, okay. This is a warning before we proceed. There is a strong ideological prejudice against the idea of consciousness changing reality. I'm going to come back to those names in brackets in just a bit. But that's quite a statement to make. I'm saying that the neutrality when it comes to understanding the world is in a shorter supply than we think. That there are people who are so ideologically dug in to particular metaphysical assumptions and things that they can't prove. They have certain faiths, not classical religious faiths, but they believe that they can understand and explain the world with the knowledge that they have. It's a fascinating case, and they exhibit very strong prejudices against stuff that challenges their beliefs. I promise you, we're going to dig into this. So these prejudices originate from bottom-up physics, and that's the key to understanding what's going on here. We want to understand why people have these prejudices. We can. If you understand the concept of bottom-up physics, and that's the notion, and it doesn't really matter where you start, so we can have some arguments as to where the bottom is, and that's fine. Maybe it's the quantum fields, maybe it's the standard model of particle physics. But when we've established this grounding in physics, then chemistry and biology, and therefore the brain and the mind, these are all just emergent phenomena stacked on top of each other. Chemistry, it's nothing more than physics. It's just a way of understanding physics, a layer of abstraction. It's still just physics. And you might find this a little bit disconcerting. It might even be very difficult for you to understand. What do you mean biology is just physics? Aren't there new emergent laws that happen with chemistry and biology? No. Everybody who really researches this stuff, give you a good example, wonderful work colleague of mine in the last job that I had, who'd been to university and they'd done physics and they'd done philosophy and they got fascinated by this. They realised what it was that I'm trying to tell you, that this bottom-up view of physics teaches us that it's not really anything in chemistry or biology, brain or mind that determines what happens next in the universe. It all comes from the bottom layers. It all comes from the standard model of particle physics, obeying these very strict mathematical laws of particle interactions. So we can draw another analogy to this, and you might get this and go, oh, crikey, right, I see what he's on about. If we think about computers, because I think computers are a bit more accessible to people, we can have different layers of abstraction. So we can go from the physical layer of the computer, where all the electrons are buzzing around, and we've got all those electrical interactions, and we're sitting at that level. We can consider the computer at more logical levels of abstraction as things get more complicated and stacked on top of each other until we get to, say, lower level languages, and then we can go higher and higher and higher. And my software development that I do sits fairly high on the stack. I'm with JavaScript and PHP. So after all of that, right at the top of the stack, you have the user experience, but you have to understand that there's nothing that's happening on your computer that hasn't been determined just by all those electrons buzzing around in the CPU. Like, there's no magic going on. There's no new emerging laws. It's all just one thing stacked on top of another. And what we're saying is reality is kind of exactly the same thing. And this is why we hit a really wonderful and interesting problem. You see, this view kills free will. It kills self-determination. And there'll be some semantic games that people play and a little bit of mental gymnastics, so people like Sean Carroll can say things like, well, as a collection of atoms, you don't have free will, but as a person, you do. It's just cognitive dissonance. It's just the same sort of excuses that you've heard, and I'm being very harsh there, so I do apologise. But it's the same sort of thing as people saying, well, I'm a scientist, but I do believe that Jesus walked on water. There's something that doesn't mesh up there. Maybe he did. I don't want to completely rule it out, but I'm just trying to point out the conflict, right? So it's all right dumping on people who believe things that don't match up with science. But Sean Carroll's one of them, and you should understand that. It's sort of like, well, I'd use the science toolkit for my science stuff, but I can't apply that to regular life. I'd go mad. If you believe things that are mad so that you can't apply them to real life, maybe there's a problem with what you believe. All right, so it's this bottom-up approach that determines that we don't have free will. And this is where things get really interesting. And this is covered in lecture 2. If consciousness doesn't change reality, because it can't, as it's an emergent high-level phenomenon, how come it can talk about itself in reality? If I want to have a phone call with someone, I have to talk. I have to modify and create the air, create vibrations in it. I have to send information through a physical reality, which means I have to change the physical reality to send the information through. A painter who's got a canvas needs to modify the canvas to convey something, unless they're trying to be really smart and clever. It's a blank canvas. Oh, what does that mean? Do you see what I'm getting at here? If you really think about it, you should be able to come to the realization that you, as a conscious being, change physical reality. And this is like common sense to most people. But if you believe in bottom-up physics, the notion that anyone could tell you that consciousness changes reality is just hippie woo-woo. And that's really important to keep in mind. So, quantum mechanics offers us this fantastic place to look for the effect that we need. Because there are multiple possible things that could happen at any given moment. Well, this is exactly what we want for mind. We want to be able to have choices about how our lives turn out. We want to be able to live, as one of the quantum mechanics pioneers said, in a participatory universe. We want to see ourselves as active parts of the universe, where our decisions matter, where we have no fate, but the fate that we make for ourselves. This is the human story. It's what's important to us. It's what gives our lives meaning, right? And these guys, they're ideologically opposed to this, but they'll not admit to it. They've got a kind of double talk going on. Now, quantum mechanics offers us this wonderful place to look for a mechanism where high-level functions, high-level like mind, or it looks high-level, could select between multiple possible outcomes. Doesn't matter what interpretation of quantum mechanics you've got, they all give that potential. And so this is why people get very excited about the idea that consciousness might be able to influence quantum mechanics. Really important point. I'm only saying it's a great place to look, Because if we don't look at quantum mechanics, if we go, no, this is just nonsense, because we can say that consciousness changes reality, and we can say that the fact that it talks about itself, it self-expresses through physical reality, because we can say that's the proof of it, like, you don't get an option about there being top-down effects of mind controlling reality. You don't get a choice about that. I believe that quantum mechanics gives us the most reasonable and rational first place to start looking. So perhaps it's not quantum mechanical, right? Perhaps it's not. Perhaps they're correct. Perhaps Sean Carroll, Neil deGrasse Tyson, when they go on Joe Rogan's show and they dump all over consciousness being part of the wave function collapse, perhaps they're right. Perhaps they're right, but then we're going to have to look at something far more extraordinary and magical, and they're going to like that even less. Some of our top minds believe crazy things, and we want to understand why. We don't want to just mock them. We want to understand why they think this, and then we want to understand why it couldn't possibly be correct, and then we want to understand what it is that we want to find or look for in order to fix the mess that's been created here. And this is why the best thinking around the connection between quantum mechanics and consciousness is interesting. I'm not just trying to use it as a vague excuse, as the straw men that some people use to attack these ideas go for. I mean, obviously there's always some people that just come out with nonsense, but, you know, consider Steel Manning the idea. So, just to finish off, accepting that consciousness can change reality makes exceptional conscious experiences look way more reasonable than anything you get from mainstream physicalism. We know that the way these people look at the world is wrong because it doesn't account for conscious choice. But as soon as you allow consciousness's role of playing a strange effect on reality, then these exceptional conscious experiences seem way more credible. So, if you don't believe that consciousness has the ability to talk about itself in the physical world, if you've got yourself tied in knots, right, about the power that consciousness has, and you're in complete denial of it, then the idea that consciousness can have exceptional experiences and that there's a reality behind them is just absolutely absurd. Absolute nonsense. And you can see the way these people are kicking back against it. Right, I've given you that warning, that primer. Let's carry on with the show properly, eh? Should we take any conscious experience seriously? It's a question worth asking, right? So, illusionists, like Daniel Dennett, for example, they are very confused. Very, very poor confused people. I'll explain why. If you don't think that consciousness is real, if you don't think that consciousness is anything other than an illusion, that it's not actually present, a user illusion, shall we say, how do you then see conscious experiences as being valid or present? Right? Unicorn horns, right? If you don't believe in unicorns, how could you believe in unicorn horns? That's stupid. So, same goes here. If you don't believe in consciousness, how can you believe in conscious experiences? And so people like Daniel Dennett would seem to. I don't understand how you can possibly value human life without cognitive dissonance if you don't believe in consciousness. Because for someone like me, the reason I don't want to hurt you is I recognise that you're capable of feeling suffering. And feeling suffering isn't just some behaviour of a mechanistic system to me. I believe that you've got a consciousness, an inner self that feels pain. Okay, so we could be mistaken about any conscious experience. I'm afraid this is true, you know. We can hallucinate, we can misremember. There's all sorts of ways that we can get confused about what's actually happened. Eyewitness testimony is problematic, so we only have to look at psychology to understand just how worrying eye testimony is. It's quite concerning. Although so is psychology. Massive replication problems. So perhaps eyewitness testimony is actually better than we think, because psychology's a mess in terms of Can we actually replicate experiments properly? And that's been a controversy that's happened over the last few years. But I'm not trying to knock psychology. Let's just try and put our best foot forward and try and figure it out and try and correct any mistakes. But one has to wonder, at least. Science is empirical. What are we talking about here? Right, so when we say empirical, what we mean is it's derived from our experience, our conscious experience. Science is based on our conscious experience. But I love science. It's what gives us computers and high technology. It allows us to have cars driving around the place, freezers to keep our food cold. Good grief, it's a wonderful thing. I love science and technology. I want the Star Trek future where we're whizzing around in space in the future, and I want humanity to improve, to progress towards a future that we can all agree is a better thing, which is, I want to just be careful with the words that I'm using there. But I love the idea of the Star Trek future. And we're not going to do that by abandoning science. So the reason that science is able to get a bit more of a foothold on what's actually going on is because it's built to try and get some of the flakiness away from conscious experience and the ways that we can misremember things, and it tries to make an analysis of some more underlying truth. Well, we also have to make sure that when we conduct our lives normally, that we're somewhat sane. You know, if you get home and from a day's work and you see your partner at home and they're like, "How was work?" And you're like, "Well, I think I went to work. I think I went to work. I mean, I've got a memory of going to work, but how do I know that I actually went to work?" You know, if you live in doubt of your normal conscious experience on a moment-to-moment basis, you might have some real issues. You know, I don't mean that in an unpleasant way. I mean, I think that could be psychologically destabilizing. So why should exceptional conscious experiences be treated differently? Huh? Well, the argument for that is that people make impossible claims. Superficially, seems perfectly reasonable. They do seem to. But how do we know what's impossible? Impossible things! Impossible things that turned out to be possible. Right, so if we're just going to slap the label of impossible on things, it seems only reasonable that we should understand just how terrible that we are at this, right? The chemical composition of stars. It's impossible to know. Until 1859. But why? Why did so many intelligent people think that we'd never know the chemical composition of stars? Well, the reason is because, first of all, you have to leave the Earth, right? You have to leave the Earth. How the hell are you going to do that? You're just going to jump really hard? Build a really big catapult? You have to understand that it's very obvious for us to say, oh, you just build a rocket, right? That's easy to say now. It wasn't before, right? I mean, that's sort of like saying, oh, how do you get more reliable telepathy? Oh, you know, you just engage in more psi-conducive practices. You know, it's that same mystical mechanism. You just MacGuffin. You just throw a MacGuffin at it, and that explains it all. Oh, that's how we do it. So the rocket is kind of the MacGuffin that solves the problem. But before the MacGuffin was known, the chemical composition of stars, you had to get off the planet. You had to get close enough to a sun. Do you have any idea how much more massive a sun is than the Earth? Do you have any concept of the gravitational pull of a sun? How do you think you're going to get anything off the surface of a sun and survive, right? How do you expect to go fast enough around a sun, to have such an enormous speed around the sun that you're not just going to plummet straight into it. And how are you going to solve the problem of the resistance that you get from, any sort of solar flares or anything that might impede your progress as you get closer to the sun, Right, let's assume that you manage to get to the surface of the sun. Exactly how are you going to scoop up a bit of the surface of the sun? Huh? What material are you going to use for that? Oh, and we could obviously say, well, what about some sort of magnetic containment? Well, good luck with that. Maybe you'll manage it. But, we are talking about earlier times in our the way that we understand the universe here. So, chemical composition of stars, never going to happen. 1859, it did. Because Fraunhofer and work that was done in that area, we understood that stars give off light that can be spread out over a spectrum. We can see particular dark bands in that spectrum that correspond to absorption spectra of the chemicals involved. Absorption and emission spectra, they're wonderful things about chemical elements. And they've allowed us to do analysis of the chemical composition of stars. So that impossible thing turned out to be possible. Meteorites coming from space. Wow. Taken for granted now, but there was a time when we couldn't. It was impossible. No, meteorites don't come from space. How? Don't be so stupid. That's the way that we approach this. And it only changed when 300 people witnessed it in 1790. And that led to a chain of events where we realised that meteorites did come from space. Heavier than air flight. Shockingly, many scientists and engineers thought that heavier than air flight was an impossibility. Presumably they'd not seen f***ing birds, Animals happen to be heavier than air, fly around it all the time, but still, somehow, so many scientists and engineers of the time still thought that heavier than air flight was impossible, even though they got examples of it working around them. How you explain that, I don't know. I think humans are fundamentally more stupid than we ever care to admit. I'm a human too, I'm not trying to exclude myself from that category. Most notably was the physicist Lord Kelvin, but he's contributed positively to humanity, so thank you, sir, for that. That's why we've got this scale of temperature from absolute zero, and we call it Kelvin, So that was all impossible. All that heavier than air flight was impossible until 1903. The Wright brothers, they put a rest to that silly nonsense. Objects being in two places at the same time, well, come on, we must have all fallen for that one. You can't have an object that's in two places at the same time, you don't have to be an expert in Aristotelian logic to figure that one out, do you? But in 1927, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics sort of blew that out of the water. What do we call an object being in two places at the same time now? We call it a superposition. Quantum mechanics in biology. Oh my God. So this is being rewritten retrospectively, it would seem, in history. I'm astonished at this. If you look up quantum biology, we can see a narrative where the earlier quantum mechanics pioneers speculated about the role quantum mechanics might play in biology. But go back to the 1990s and it was impossible. In the 1990s, physicist Max Tegmark said that biology is far too warm and wet to support quantum mechanics. Oh no. And this is kind of in response to the notion that perhaps quantum mechanics was going on in our brains. Maybe the weirdness of quantum mechanics was something that powered consciousness or any sort of cognition. It doesn't have to be consciousness, but maybe our brains are using quantum mechanics in weird ways we don't understand. No. Max Tegmark and other people, many other people, supported his position. Just said, you can't do that. You can't have quantum mechanics in biology. Too warm and wet, like I've already said. And this would have been a real pisser for quantum biology, which is now a field which is growing. So what was the killer evidence for that? Well, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis requires quantum mechanical effects to work. So be really wary about this. Be super wary about this. It's not unfair to say that scientists are at least characterised by the things that they say as shooting their mouths off about things that aren't possible and make terrible mistakes. Now, if we backtrack that a little bit, we might find that it's actually only a very small minority of them, but other people go, well, I can't see how that could work, right? So it might be that Max Tegmark, was the flag bearer, and it might be that colleagues around him went, well, I don't understand how that could work, so it seems like it's true. And then that might just get misrepresented as all these people just not knowing what they're talking about, saying, oh, it's not a thing. So we should be careful. But this is really interesting because scientists that suspend judgment are not the ones that make it to the newspapers. It's the craziest people, right? It's the people who have the most outlandish claims, like Daniel Dennett, that seem to get the time in our conscious attention as a society. And so we really shouldn't be too harsh against scientists, we really shouldn't. But we all get lulled into the sense that things are impossible when they're not. And that's something that we should really learn from. I think it might take us a long time to really get that lesson, though. Let's now look at impossible, exceptional conscious experiences having compelling evidence. So I don't mean that someone just told you down the pub that this was a thing, or that you or friend Dave is able to levitate and you've seen it for yourself. We're not really talking about that as being compelling evidence. What we're interested in is studies and scientific inquiry that seems to back these things up. Now, it doesn't have to be unanimously agreed upon, and it doesn't have to be completely accepted or mainstream, but what it does have to be is compelling and a large body of evidence, right? That's all that we're asking for. Near-death experiences. Wow, right, okay. So obviously that's what we covered a few slides ago. And I would like you to look at the video that I've included in the recommended viewing list with this lecture, where we have Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about NDEs, and I'd like you to compare that to the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS. Look at the different things that they're doing. Let's dive into the near-death experience a bit. We already covered it earlier, so I shouldn't repeat myself. So the key difference that we have here, right, between the Neil deGrasse Tyson piss on it kind of approach, and I am going to be a little harsh here because he strawmanned them. That wasn't fair. Yeah, sorry, Neil, but, you did. It's very fair and reasonable to object to NDEs because while someone's brain might have been out for the count and then they report that they had a conscious experience during that time, it's only reasonable, skeptically speaking, to say, well, that whole experience of that NDE sounds bloody marvellous, but how do you know that the brain didn't just confabulate it? Just create it as it's waking up. It didn't happen at the time that you thought it did. You just retrospectively filled it out. I mean, your brain's been half frazzled by, almost dying. What do you expect, right? So that's damning. It seems to make sense. It's a good narrative. It does fit the facts. Until you have Veridical NDEs. And the video that I will link to has Veridical NDEs. And you should understand that people swing to the strong belief in this thing when they have Veridical NDEs. So do be forgiving if these people seem to be have sort of a saccharine level of faith in these things. If that's gets under your skin and irritates you a bit, just be sympathetic to their point of view. If you'd been through an NDE and had overwhelming proof as far as you were concerned that these things are true, you'd speak like they do too. But we can be more dispassionate and logical about this. We can analyse it. If these people can say and report things that happened while their brain was out for the count, if they can relay back information that they couldn't have possibly known otherwise, that really swings the story around. That makes it, what they're saying, seem to be really valid. And it seems like the skeptical rebuff is just an attempt to dismiss this evidence. But we should bear in mind that veridical NDEs are much fewer in number than NDEs in total. Reincarnation. Wow, right, okay. Another example here of 2 videos I'd love you to take a look at. I'm going to include them, and there's going to be a bit about Dr. Ian Stevenson's 2,500 cases, where he tried to see whether it was reasonable for the children to have known information about these past lives they're reporting on by other means. Is this something where it's all just a story? Or does that not make sense in these studies? You know, how could they possibly have got all the information which they're reporting? And that really makes a difference between people just making stuff up and suggestion and it being a real phenomenon. And that's why this is the area where you need to do case studies. So lots of case studies have happened with reincarnation. It's not all about Ian Stevenson either, but he's just a very prominent researcher in the field. And I want you to have a look then at the argument against it from Seeker. Now, I really like that YouTube channel on the whole, but I think they've done a shameful job of covering this, because if you're going to just assume that it's people suggesting things because they want money, that's a dismissive slapdown that anyone can play with, right? You start throwing that ball around and everyone's going to feel entitled to it. That's very destructive, and they shouldn't have done it, in my opinion. Let's carry on. Telepathy. Right. All right, I've had experiences of this, but I don't personally have conclusive subjective proof to believe that this is definitely a real thing, right? So I've had telepathic experiences, and my God, they're wonderful. I love the feeling of it. However, perhaps it's part of my subconscious mind that is modelling the minds of people who I am close to and predicting their behaviour and delivering it to me as a telepathic experience, right? I don't really care, in a sense, if telepathy is real or not. I mean, obviously I do, but even if it wasn't real, I'm still getting a lot out of the telepathic experience, you know? It doesn't really have to be real for me to be getting utility out of it and having fun with it. But there are many times where I would struggle to explain that it wasn't telepathy, but I'm just not convinced, all right? I'm just not convinced personally. However, let's look at the studies, right? So telepathy has a bad rap from the Zenacard days in the 1930s. Early on, there were issues with sensory leakage with badly designed experiments, and when that was removed, when the sensory leakage issue was solved by, say, moving people to a different room, then the significance of the telepathy results just went to zero. And that really has sat in the minds of skeptics as a cautionary tale, and it seems to be evidence for some people that lingers to this day that it was all just a load of nonsense. However, different techniques, things like Ganzfeld, where you'll have ping pong balls over your eyes and a red light, so sensory deprivation states used in conjunction with telepathy experiments, that produces interesting results. Rupert Sheldrake's also seems to have pioneered. I do hope I'm right in that. I don't think anyone else was doing telephone telepathy before. I think it was Sheldrake who pioneered it. I could be wrong. Leave a comment if I am. Telephone telepathy. So the idea here is that people make a report that they pick up the phone and it's a friend and they're like, oh, I was just thinking about you, huh? Right? I'm sure we've probably all been there. There's a skeptical rebuff against this, but, you know, it's an anecdotal hypothesis either way. So let's collect data. Telephone telepathy experiments run on the basis that there's an arrangement made beforehand. So the experimenting team will have, say, 4 people who will call you at a random time. So the experimental team will get in touch with one of the people that you know or don't know, depending on how they're doing the experiment. And they will ask that person to call you. Now, you won't have a caller ID or a special ringtone. You won't know who's calling you, but then you have to press a button to say who you think it is. Now, because it's 1 in 4, we'd expect you to always be at a 1 in 4 chance. We'd expect you to be right 1 in 4 times, you know, broadly speaking in general. And when people didn't know the other person, when it was a stranger, then there was no telepathic effect, and it was 1 in 4. When they were tested it again with people they were emotionally close to, this could rise to 1 in 3. It's not shocking, you know. It's not like, oh my god, they were able to tell every time. No, they weren't. But there was a statistically significant effect. And this is in laboratory conditions. So there's speculation that in certain situations in life, this can rise. It's also worth mentioning that people like Chris French, who seems to be a very genuine, lovely person, I've met him, you know, I've had a conversation with him actually, when he did a talk in Manchester. They've replicated these studies. It's also worth noting that they haven't replicated it precisely in the way that Sheldrake did it. They did some tweaks to it to replicate it, and Sheldrake has some quibbles there, but nevertheless, they replicated it and got no results indicating anything. So this is awkward. It's sort of like good, competent people on both sides, if you assume good faith on both sides, are getting conflicting results. That's the most interesting area for me. I want an explanation for that. I want everyone involved to figure it out together. That's what I would love to see. I want to know the truth, right? It's very easy, though, in a situation like this, to just pick sides. You know, if you've got 2 sides, both of them you assume competency and good faith, and the answers are conflicting, well, just choose the one that matches your ideology. So, you know, if I was more interested in being a spiritual hippie, for example, than I am in knowing what's really going on, I'd just go, oh yeah, Sheldrake's right, Chris French must be wrong, right? If I'm a skeptic and I'm like, oh, all that hippie woo-woo nonsense, I'm going, Chris French is right, Rupert Sheldrake is wrong. Well, you're just picking sides, you know? That's what's really interesting about this stuff. Yeah. Same sort of deal with presentiment, and the story there is with Chris French versus Daryl Bem or Dean Radin. And it's not just Chris French. I mean, he's just the more vocal. There's Richard Weissman, and there's others as well in the sort of the skeptical community who don't find replicated results here. And again, there's also more than just Dean Radin, Rupert Sheldrake and Daryl Bem on the other side. But there are certain people that rise to prominence, and those are the people who you'll find the most information on. Let's just cover presentiment. So, presentiment is shocking stuff. Gorgeously wonderful, shocking stuff. I mean, if it's real, if it's true, the things that it's telling us about our consciousness are just fabulous. Just incredible. So, gosh, it's just worth looking at. Let's do this. So, you won't get an explanation from me that's as good as an explanation that will be in the recommended viewing list if you take the time to watch these scientists speak for themselves. But I'll give you a flavour for it, right? We want to know, in a presentiment experiment, if you're capable of having an emotional reaction to something a few seconds before it's happened. This is X-Files stuff, man. It's wonderful. I'm serious. I'm not joking. I'm not pulling your leg. The experimental setup for this was, we'll have a computer monitor, or, we'll have a screen in front of somebody. And what we're going to do is we're going to, some of the time, randomly, we want to show a calm, peaceful image, like a nice landscape, maybe a beach, something nice and peaceful. And some of the time, randomly, we want to show you something that's emotionally arousing, right? Just get you going, whatever. So it would be violent, or it would be, and I'm not doing any sort of actions for the next one, it might be pornographic, right? It's something that's there to elicit an emotional response from the subject. As strong as possible is desirable, because it's an experiment. We want to maximize the effect so we can record them. So we do this. We have a setup so they're looking at the screen for a few seconds. After a few seconds, a quantum random number generator is used to pick one of those images we have in that library and show it on the screen. We want the quantum random number generator because it's the truest source of randomness that we're aware of at the moment. Okay. So the last thing that anyone would really seriously expect is for presentiment to be real, right? It sounds far too much like woo-woo nonsense. So what we should find in the results then, if it's not true, is that all of the emotional response should happen after the stimulus is presented to the subject. Like, there's absolutely no way that we should see the subject starting to respond to the picture before the picture's even chosen. That's nuts. And that's exactly what's going on. Impossible exceptional conscious experiences that I've had. All right, personal testimony, worthless. I know. But it's worthless from the point of view of me convincing you that this stuff is real, right? Because that's not how we do scientific inquiry. Everybody's got a mad claim to make, right? Or at least it seems that way. But I want to point out a really important difference to you here, because there's this whole world of difference between intellectually knowing something before, oh yes, telepathy seems like a thing according to the scientific data, or at least it could be. Oh, that's permission for me to feel it, isn't it? Because other people agree that it's real, then maybe I could allow myself to have an experience like that, or presentiment, or anything, right? There's one thing knowing something intellectually, but to actually experience it for yourself, my God. Now, I already said that I've had experiences with telepathy, but I still can't quite buy into it completely. I can't completely accept that I'm having genuine telepathic experiences because I haven't hit that level of evidence that would convince me that it's definitely a real thing. I'm very open-minded to it, though. I'll lean into it. I'll lean into it with some skepticism. If somebody tells me they know what I'm thinking, I'm like, oh, let's play this game. Yeah, maybe they're right. But I'll also think maybe they're just wrong. I'm cautious with this. The thing I'm about to talk to you about, though, is something that I've replicated so well in certain situations and conditions, that's stood up so well to critical analysis, that I've had such a good opportunity to collect data on from my own personal subjective experience, that for me, this is real. This has passed the test. I'm going to talk to you about it. Psi Based Empathy, also I've called it in the past, my tantric experiences. Now I'm going to call it Psi Based Empathy rather than Tantra, because Tantra is a big umbrella. It's got a lot of associated beliefs with it, and I want to really pick at the very specific thing that I'm on about. Empathy is not spooky. Empathy is not woo-woo. Empathy is mirror neurons and subconscious body language recognition. It's the way that we empathize with people because of our standard psychology, because of all the normal things that happen. Psi-based empathy is where you've got an empathic response when you've got no damn right to know, right? When our conventional understanding of the universe is completely insufficient to explain why you've got this empathic experience. Right, so I should dig into mine. There's a woman that I have a dysfunctional but sincere love for. Things went wrong between us, and every so often we'd meet up, but there'd be years in between visits, and I had such strong feelings for her. In April 2012, she arrived to where I was living at the time, which was Shipley in Yorkshire, just if you're interested. It had been a long time since I'd seen her, years, and we had a little bit of a catch-up. Now, I'm going to disclose as much as I can, disclose as much as I dare for a YouTube video, and say that we did have a little bit of a chat in which I said I would like to explore Tantra, but my conception of what Tantra was, and it was just a passing comment, and that's very important to set it up properly, but my expectation was that Tantra was self-induced, that it was hypnotic suggestion. It's sort of, you do the ritual for Tantra often enough and you'll have these amazing experiences. It's hypnosis, it's not complicated. That must be the way that it works. But try it with a partner for long enough, take it seriously enough, and you'll feel it, you'll have that experience. Why not? You know, people can convince themselves of all sorts of things. Why not convince yourself of something beautiful? Even if it's a beautiful lie. So, Tantra. That's what I thought of it. That's what I believed it was. That's what I believed the truth of Tantra was. But I've sort of mentioned it to her and said, you know, I think it might be cool. You know, if I was in a serious, committed, long-term relationship with someone, I would love to explore Tantra with them. And that was that. So, we skip forward a few hours. She's face down, top naked, on my bed, and I'm giving her a back massage. She can't see what's going on. You know, it's not like I can give her visual cues. We haven't made any arrangements to actually do Tantra or anything like that. We've just had conversations about other things since then. And I'm massaging her back, and I become aware of just how strong my feelings are for this woman. And I can feel the emotional energy of my love and connection for her from the tips of my fingers to the tips of my toes. And this is a new thing for me. I'm used to feeling my emotions localized in my chest and sort of like vaguely fading out from that point, with it just sort of being a sort of a feeling that's in a localized place. Never before have I had a feeling that was just all throughout my body. That was incredible. And while this happened, a voice popped into my head. Not literally like an English voice, but more of a notion of, why don't you try pushing your feelings into her, Matthew? And I scoffed. I laughed at the idea in my head. I was like, yeah, right, okay. This is ridiculous. And then I'm in my bedroom and I've got her for company. There's no one else around. Who's going to judge me? I'm like, why don't I try it? I mean, what am I going to do? Just to be embarrassed with myself? That's a small price I can pay. So I gave it a go. And she starts moaning like crazy. This is a very happy woman. This is a woman making very happy woman noises. I mean, wow. Okay. So I stop. And she calms down. Almost instantly. Just tails off. So I start again. And she starts moaning again. I just did it, right? I didn't think about how I was going to push my feelings into her. I just did it. Same way as I just raised my arm just now. I don't think about how to raise my arm. You just do it. And I stopped and started this. For this period of time, while I felt this way about her, this was under my conscious command. I could push my feelings into her at will and stop it at will. So I did that about 3 times and it correlated perfectly, and I freaked out a little bit because this isn't supposed to be possible. I don't really believe in magic. I mean, it's on the back burner if anyone can convince me, but this is wild. This shouldn't be happening. This couldn't possibly be real. What the hell's going on? Okay. Right, so I take a break. I mean, not a big break, but this is, I stop for a bit and I just think, so how can I put controls on this situation? Well, she can't see me, you know, her face is in the pillow. She's lying down on her front for a back massage. Okay. Audio cues. Well, tell you what, do you know any noises that you can make that make a woman do that? If you do, why don't you make a recording of them? Put them on YouTube. You'll be quite popular. You'll get a lot of views. All right. So, pre-arrangement. I'm like, well, apart from that passing reference to the fact that I'd like to do it in the future with someone I really love and care about in a long-term relationship, which isn't the situation that we were in, that was it. I haven't hypnotized her. I haven't primed her. I haven't done any work to make her ready or have this experience. And I could have. I know how to hypnotize people. I taught myself that a long time ago. There is no rational explanation for this. Okay. Testing. Randomize the timing. The massage, it's a wild shot. It's a long shot. It's a bit wild, sorry. But boring, simple, circular, repeatable massages. I mean, I don't know how I could possibly make someone moan like that just with a massage, but let's just keep it boring and simple. So I did that. 7 or 8 correlations later, with me randomizing the timing more of when I'm pushing my emotional energy into her, and I get perfect correlations all the time with her moaning and the rest of it. Now, I will include a video to something that is as close as possible that I found that shows you this, but in that video, the guy was not touching the subject. I was touching her. There was physical contact. But otherwise, it looks very similar to the experience that I had. Now, after all of that, I freaked out and I couldn't believe what was going on. It was just shocking to me. Well, obviously I did believe what was going on, but it just seemed unbelievable. I told her about what was going on. I was excited. I was like, what the Donald is going on here? And she just coolly as anything says, oh, that's Tantra. And then she does it to me. And I felt her feelings like they were my own. I had this notion before that it was all just physics, chemistry, biology, brain, mind, that we were all these little islands of consciousness floating around in this physical soup, that we never really touched each other or connected with each other. It was always just a poor approximation of someone's thoughts or feelings that got related imperfectly and sloppily and imprecisely through vocalizations and behavior, and we were all just guesswork. We were all alone, really. We're just trying our best to make some sort of connection as an approximation. Well, no, this felt like we'd connected consciously, spiritually, I suppose, but I don't even know what that word meant to me at the time. Somehow it's like our consciousnesses were touching and exchanging information directly, mingling. It was weird. And I felt her feelings like they were my own, but I was just aware that they weren't. I mean, it felt like they were my feelings. They were as real to me and as tangible in my consciousness, like I was feeling them. But I also knew that they weren't mine, and I could feel what my feelings were as well at the same time, but I knew that they were mine. It's wild. And it made me cry a little bit. And I asked her some questions about how she felt for me when I'd felt that. And she didn't really want to answer them. Anyway, that's my Psi Based Empathy experience. So let's move on. Impossible, exceptional, conscious experiences that are lacking compelling evidence to date. And there's an asterisk there. We'll get to that in the footnote, right? I've given you exceptional conscious experiences that seem to have compelling evidence, even if it's not conclusive, that you would not be crazy to think that this may well be true. In fact, because there's compelling evidence for them and evidence against them, if you tell me that you know these things for a fact aren't true, then I just say, well, aren't you just cherry picking? You know, this is a really interesting position. I have to now acknowledge to you, put my hands up and be fair, that there are impossible, exceptional conscious experiences that lack this quality of evidence. right? And it's the sort of thing where it would look like you could achieve the evidence in some cases. Take OBEs, or out-of-body experiences. How hard can it be to organise a study where people have OBEs and they collect data accurately about something on a rooftop or somewhere where they wouldn't be able to get without the OBE? So there's got to be a way that we could study OBEs to confirm the reality of them. Do I see compelling evidence to date for this? No. No, not for OBEs. Let's look at mystical experiences. Now, I've had a mystical experience. I had a mystical experience where I had this profound feeling and understanding and knowing that I was actually the ground of all being. Not me personally, not just Matthew, me. I mean, just consciousness. So you as well. That consciousness was the ground of all being. Sounds like something Deepak Chopra would say, and I'm not a follower of his. I pay attention to him occasionally. But, I mean, this was sort of seeded as an idea for me by Bill Hicks, with the notion that we're all one consciousness subjectively experiencing itself. But you might say that that was what's caused this, and I could turn around to you and say, well, the Western default is what causes your perception, right? So the notion that we're all little islands of consciousness in a physical universe mysteriously popping out of brains, you know? Well, that's equally, you know, that's somewhat crazy too. That's another way of looking at the world. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But the mystical experience that I had told me that I was the ground of all being, and that would make you the ground of all being as well. Now, I would say that it's taken me years of pulling our intellectual understanding of reality apart, and I would say that that mystical experience holds up. I would say it's true. But there's a fundamental problem we have here, because how do you validate that mystical experiences in general are giving us more information on reality? How do we know they have a basis in what's real and they're not just sort of a fiction of the mind? Well, we don't have compelling evidence that they are giving us real insights when they happen. Unfortunately, we don't. Not as far as I can see. Let's move on to the psychedelic mystical experience. Well, the regular mystical experience was pretty powerful. The psychedelic mystical experience was 10 times more intense. And I should mention, if you're going to do psychedelics, they go down as well as up. Watch out for that. If you don't look after yourself properly, you might end up one of those unfortunate people who decides to take a dump on the fast lane of a live motorway. You don't live long. That's a story. That's a myth of something that actually happened around here. But, take something like DMT, and people report DMT entities. Well, how hard is it for us to research this? Why can't we have people doing DMT in one location, DMT in another? Can they transfer information via a common DMT entity, right? If they were going to a real place and they could talk to the same entity, then they should be able to transfer information for it. Like, we can easily imagine this, right? Why hasn't it been done? Why don't we have compelling evidence that the psychedelic mystical experience is based on a fundamental underlying reality? It doesn't seem hard to test for, but we don't have evidence for that. If you'd like to do an investigation into this and you're looking for volunteers to take DMT, I'll sign up. So anyway, I would like it to be legal, you know. But right, let's move on. So Psi Based Empathy, finally, right? I've talked to you about this, something like Tantra, the tantric experience. So I believe in this. I think it's real. But I'll acknowledge something. I'll give you credit, if you're a skeptic, that there's not exactly compelling evidence to date for Psi Based Empathy, for Tantra. I might be able to find a video on YouTube where someone's doing it, where it's scientists are gathered around wondering how it's happening. But that's not quite the standard of compelling evidence that we're looking for, is it? It's not like there's been studies done that verify this is a real thing. And I've got to confess to that and just be straight with you about that. So, the footnote. I would love to be shown compelling evidence for these things. I mean, I really would. What counts as compelling evidence, obviously, that's subjective. But some sort of scientific accumulation of data in replicated experiments would be just marvellous. Let's deal now with anticipated objections. What about poor experimental design in psi research? We've already covered this, right? So the notion that the early Xenocard experiments had sensory leakage, and it made us think telepathy was real with Xenocards, and later on we found out that the effect went away. Okay. Poor experimental design in psi research. Well, the solution is better experimental design. Easy. No problem there. How about psi being unreliable? The solution is simple. Statistical analysis. This was started in the 1930s by Zena, Rhine and Rhine, but this is something that we go on to see in all sort of all the subsequent serious psi research. It's all based with statistical analysis. Interestingly, the James Randi Prize didn't accept statistical evidence. Gets the noggin jogging, doesn't it? So, another solution is to seek more reliable methods. So, that Xenocard method was pretty bad. Okay, well, people explored the issue. Rather than just accepting Xenocards as a failure and just leaving it there, yes, Xenocards were a failure from the early research, but we found better ways of doing this. So Ganzfeld, marvellous different technique where we've got the sensory deprivation and that encourages a different state of mind, and it looks like we've got better results. It's excellent stuff. There's also the telephone telepathy that Rupert Sheldrake did. This is a different way of doing it, giving something that's very familiar to people already, and also by using people who are emotionally close and strangers, we were able to see that maybe this is an effect that is dependent on emotional bonds, right? If you just didn't take that into account, you might miss something really important. Let's look at the difficulties with replication. So one solution to this is to conduct meta-analyses. You can see that we essentially take all the replications, the ones that didn't produce results, the ones that did produce results, and we look at what the chances are that all this happened by chance. That's a fantastic way of dealing with issues with replication. We can just take the data that we've got and see what we make of it. Another solution, and this is something that I would love to see, is further investigation into outcome discrepancies. Chris French seems like a good guy to me. And so does Rupert Sheldrake. So, like I said before, unless you're just going to pick sides, how do we know what's going on here? I would love it if they could both have the funds and the time to work together and figure out what's going on. Like, we could get to the heart of a mystery if we tackled it in the right way, I feel. And this is something that I think would be a solution to this problem. Another anticipated objection. It's impossible. Well, the solution is, don't worry about it. Lots of things that are impossible turn out to be possible. My ideology / worldview can't explain it. And the solution is, change your ideology or your worldview. You know, if the map that you hold doesn't describe the territory that you are in, then what is wrong? Is the map wrong or is the territory wrong? I think you might need a better map. And lastly, mind over matter violates what we understand. And the solution is we need to do further scientific research to understand what's going on here. And we need to bear in mind the observation that we have a demonstrable power of free will. When consciousness talks about itself in physical reality, it's changing physical reality to self-express. That's the agency, the causality, the origin of, that's the power of consciousness. Wrapping up, right. Let's just go over the key things that we've learnt this lecture, shall we? Many exceptional conscious experiences exist. Humans have constantly called things impossible to be proven completely wrong, embarrassingly wrong. Oh my goodness me, heavier than air flight. Have they not seen birds? We have evidence for some exceptional conscious experiences being real. There is academic disagreement on whether psi exists, and we should take it seriously. I'm not in favour of just pouring scorn or throwing names or just assuming people are incompetent because I'm going to choose a narrative. There is disagreement on whether psi exists. It's not like we can say that it doesn't, and it's not really like we can say that it does. Lastly, and this is the magic of the episode if you really pay attention, like this lecture, the thing that you should take away from it, if you take nothing else away from it, is this. Due to free will being demonstrable, the question is not whether mind over matter exists. It's how far it goes. Thank you for your attention.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature's made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
Consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.